Hi, it's Miss Lynn here. I'm just going to take you through some notes and some slides to kind of recap what we've been talking about the past couple of days. And you guys should be taking notes on this presentation as well. So we are going to kind of make some final connections here between lactase evolution and enzymes and biomolecules. So we're all on the same page here. So what you see on this screen are the four molecules that are considered biomolecules. Remember, bio means life, so these are the four molecules that make up life. These four molecules are carbohydrates, nucleic acids, proteins, and lipids. Carbohydrates are what we've been talking about with sugars, like starch is an example. And remember, each of these four biomolecules have long chains called polymers, and then the monomers that make up those long chains. So besides carbohydrates, we also have nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. We have proteins, which we've talked about, how they need to be folded to have their function, and enzymes are an example. And the only one that we haven't really talked about are lipids, which are fats, but we'll talk about that later on throughout the year. So one biomolecule that we need to focus on is carbohydrates. The scientific name for carbohydrates are saccharides. Basically, it just means sugar. There are different types of saccharides or sugars. If you look at the different types of carbohydrates, you can see that the monosaccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides, they each have a different prefix, and their prefix means what they mean. So a monosaccharide is a sugar or a carbohydrate that has one molecule. A polysaccharide, remember poly means many, that has a lot of saccharide molecules. And a word that we haven't really used yet, but that we will, is a disaccharide that contains two saccharide molecules. So you can see here that two monosaccharides together will give you a disaccharide. For example, glucose and galactose make up lactose, which we already know. Glucose and fructose, for example, will give you sucrose. So if two monosaccharides bond together, then they'll form a disaccharide. Sucrose is, once again, a scientific name, and that's what table sugar is. So we already are familiar with this concept on this slide here. Remember, lactose is the polysaccharide, the sugar that's in milk, and that can be broken down into monosaccharides or its monomers, which are galactose and glucose, which are smaller sugars. We are also familiar that the enzyme that does this process is lactase. Remember, lactase is the enzyme that breaks down lactose, which the polysaccharide, into its monomers, the monosaccharides of galactose and glucose. So you can see here in this slide, there's a very large, complicated structure here. That's just the lactase enzyme. And we know that lactase is a protein. It's an enzyme, and it has a specific three-dimensional structure, and that's going to determine its function, which is to break apart lactose, the milk sugar. So you can see that lactose right here is bound to the active site of the lactase enzyme. And what's going to happen is that enzyme is going to break up the lactose into its monomers, which are galactose and glucose, its monosaccharides. And we all also know that this happens through a hydrolysis reaction. So we add water, and the adding of water is what it actually breaks that lactose down into its simpler parts. So how is this really connected to genetics and evolution? Well, you can see here that this is an unreplicated chromosome, and this is chromosome number 2, where we have our gene for lactase. Everyone has the gene for lactase. Whether you're lactose intolerant or you're lactose tolerant, you still have the gene for lactase. What the difference is in people that are lactose tolerant or intolerant is if the gene is turned on or not. Okay, so the lactase gene is always turned on in infants because infants need to digest breast milk from their mother in order to have nutrients. So that gene is always turned on. Now, what normally happens is that gene turns off, even though it's still there, it just turns off when we go into adulthood. But because of the mutation on chromosome 2, in some individuals, the gene for lactase is turned on into adulthood, and that makes that person lactase persistent or lactose tolerant. Usually, though, in most of the population, this is the case here, where the gene is turned off and we are lactase non-persistent or lactose intolerant. You can see here that we have a map, okay, and basically 10,000 years ago, 100% of this area was lactose intolerant. The gene was turned off. So it was turned on in infancy, but as people grow older, it was turned off. A lot of things happened 10,000 years ago. For one, we started to domesticate cattle in some cultures. We became better at farming. So that was kind of a new environmental pressure that entered the environment. And in some populations, like in Eastern Africa and in Europe, they started to harvest cattle and raise livestock. So more milk and dairy products were introduced into people's diets. So it's pointing here that the lactose tolerance arises and increases in frequency. Now, that's not just because people drink more milk so they become more tolerant. What happens is that there is an advantage to people who have the gene turned on in adulthood because they can actually digest and get nutrients from the milk and the dairy, so those people are more likely to survive. It's not that the drinking the milk turns the gene on, it's that drinking the milk and being able to digest the milk actually gives someone an advantage to live in their environment, so they're going to survive more often. What happens when people survive? They reproduce and they pass down their genes. Same thing happens in Africa. The lactose tolerance arises several times through a mutation. Even though it's a different mutation, those people are still able to digest milk, and that gives them an advantage to survive in their environment. And that is how the gene becomes more frequent, and more people in the population start to be born with the gene turned on all throughout life. This, you can see, kind of maps out areas where the lactose gene is controlled. Okay, so this would be indigenous America before a lot of people immigrated over. But this would be the areas where there was lactose intolerance because this was before the mutation arose. And the gene on chromosome 2 gets turned off into adulthood, so those people are lactose intolerant. Now there's this mutation that pops up where the C nucleotide in that section of chromosome 2 is replaced with the T nucleotide, and that mutation codes for lactose tolerance. Same thing happens in area number 3, except for the mutation is different. There was one of 3 single nucleotide changes, but still we get the lactose tolerance as the mutation. So as time goes on, more and more people have that mutation because it is actually favorable and it gets inherited. So now if you inherit that mutation from your ancestors, you're able to digest milk and milk sugars, and you are considered lactase persistent. And now you can enjoy that milkshake. So hopefully that little review helped you guys and you took some notes, and thanks for listening.